Professor Gordon Lloyd, our distinguished speaker today. I also want to thank the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation for making this lecture possible. Is this better? Oh, I think it's off, right? Is it better? No? Maybe? Maybe. Okay, good. It is a pleasure to be able to celebrate Milton Friedman's legacy today. So we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of his birth and the 50-year anniversary of Capitalism and Freedom. Right? Celebrating Milton Friedman is very important since he was one of the most influential economists and defenders of freedom of our time. And I'm very excited we're going to be able to celebrate it with Professor Lloyd's lecture. Professor Lloyd completed all coursework toward a doctorate in economics at the University of Chicago before receiving his master's and PhD degrees in government at Claremont Graduate School. And I have to emphasize that Professor Lloyd was a student of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. Professor Lloyd is a co-author of 3 books on the American founding and sole author of a book on the political economy of the New Deal. He also has numerous articles, reviews, and opinion editorials to his credit. His latest co-authored book, The Two Narratives of Political Economy, was published in 2010. Among several other things, Professor Lloyd currently serves on the National Advisory Council for the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Presidential Learning Center through the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. The plan for today is that Professor Lloyd will present his ideas for around 30-40 minutes. Then we will open up the floor for questions. There will be also a short reception outside, so please make sure you join us today's reception, where Professor Lloyd will hang out and be also around if you have any questions and if you want to talk to him. And then I also want to mention that I have around 10 copies of Capitalism and Freedom. We already distribute some copies among the students, but if you don't have a copy and if you want to get a free copy of Capitalism and Freedom, at the end of the lecture it will be more like in a first-come, first-served basis. You can come over here and I will be happy to give you a complimentary copy. But please join me to welcome Professor Lloyd.
Thank you very much. It's also the 75th anniversary of Pepperdine. I think this is one way to celebrate the existence of Pepperdine and also to commemorate the work of Milton Friedman. And you need to start off with some quote or the other, so I will. One of my favorite Friedman sayings is, if you let the federal government run the Sahara Desert, within 5 years there'll be no sand. And that sort of sums up Friedman's understanding that the challenge to liberty does not come from ourselves. The challenge to liberty comes from outside, and usually some form of government. So instinctively, Friedman is going to put the blame, if blame has to be placed, on the government, particularly the federal government, for the causes of various distresses. He is credited with influencing Ronald Reagan, and I think we can see that in terms of the movement toward privatization in the 1980s, the attempt to deregulate a number of activities. He's also been credited with helping or hindering Margaret Thatcher in her attempt to dismantle or at least, maybe implode the welfare state of Britain. But I think her influence is probably more from von Hayek than it is from Friedman, and her task was probably even more difficult in the European setting than it is in the American setting. He is also discredited by the left for helping Pinochet in Chile. And that's where the Chicago boys had a great influence in reviving the Chilean economy, but supposedly at the expense of propping up a right-wing dictator who shouldn't have been there in the first place. And so this whole question of what is the relationship between capitalism and freedom comes to the front when you think of Pinochet. In fact, in 1977, Friedman gave a lecture, a talk to the associates, as Dean Wilburn will let you know about. He was influential in that setting. And this was the first associates dinner, and Friedman introduced his talk by saying, well, I'm here at the hotel, but I had to pass through some people who were protesting, trying to stop me from speaking. And the protest was about his association with Pinochet. So we can talk about that. When I'm talking about a commemoration of Friedman at this particular time, it doesn't mean to say that I'm trying to present an ideological, classical liberal view. But what I want to do is to say, as the title suggests, still becoming an echo.
Yeah,
Right? He's still going after all these years. And I think that one way to frame that going after all these years is somehow his ideas seem to be influential, but how about the practice? And I think we should talk about that. To what extent has his ideas turned into public policy in practice, over against his ideas really influencing us to keep thinking about the role of liberty? And that in itself is a huge accomplishment. If we start off by taking just a very simple, obvious approach that Friedman would take. I mean, if you try to inflate your way out of trouble in public policy, what do you get? And the obvious answer is inflation. If you deficit your way out of trouble, what do you get? The answer is deficits. And that kind of obvious, simple approach towards essentially macro politics, the revival of monetarism, the idea that the central bank shouldn't fiddle, etc., has quite some impact in ideas. But I don't know that it has such an impact in practice. But if we look now, again, as a simple approach to what we're trying to do, take a look at the title of this book. It's called Capitalism and Freedom. In ideas country, that's realm, that's not a bad connection. We can see the connection. But in practice, it seems to be not so obvious. For example, I grew up in the West Indies on an island called Trinidad that was, quote, liberated, unquote, from colonialism in the early 1960s after British rule for a long time. And the liberator was a guy called Eric Williams. And Eric Williams, like many sort of colonial to post-colonial leaders, were educated in Britain. And he educated either at Oxford or the London School of Economics, where capitalism did not have a very good name. There were pockets, Robbins, for example. But the whole thing was that capitalism led to doom, or capitalism led, in Eric Williams' case, to slavery. And the whole idea of liberation from slavery means that you have to realize that you have to liberate yourself also from capitalism. There are other headings: capitalism and greed, capitalism and doom, capitalism and destruction, capitalism and self-destruction. So that in one sense, what seems to us to be fairly obvious, capitalism and freedom, is not so obvious in practice as is shown by if you look at African countries, India in its beginning, you take a look at South American countries, it was not so obvious that capitalism led to freedom. Actually, that the state of colonialism was intimately connected. But that's not the kind of capitalism that Friedman was talking about. That's much more like mercantilism, colonialism, controlling the markets. But let's take a look, capitalism and freedom. What I think he is trying to suggest, and we can, again, talk about this in clear ways, is that you cannot have freedom, individual freedom, political freedom. By the way, by political freedom, he does not mean majority rule. he means much more liberty. And liberty comes from some kind of constitutionalism, and certainly comes from free markets, which is going to be his point. So freedom as political freedom does not mean majority rule. It means rights, property rights, inheritance rights, free speech, as you can see in the readings. He will support people who are clearly contrary to his own views. Free speech, including his own, that he would like to speak about. So that's what he means by political freedom. Individual freedom means the right, as he said at that conference, and I'm quoting him because I wouldn't use this language, to be a damn fool. But I'm a Pepperdine, so I say darn fool. but freedom, by the way, Professor Sexton was the first person to introduce me to the Pepperdine language. When I said, I remember the very first time we were together, about 12 years ago, I said, that's a smart ass who said, smart aleck. So I have learned my lesson, but so I now quote people when it's a quotation, when it's a naughty word. So Friedman said, freedom is to be a damn fool, which means essentially that I should be free to make mistakes in my own life. So it's not just political freedom, it's social freedom, it's individual freedom. That I should be able to I guess, to put things in my body, that's because it's my body, and it's not, but it's not good for you. And that's the kind of thing that Friedman is fighting. He's fighting the notion that there are do-gooders in the world who know what's good for me, and therefore I ought to do it because it's good for me. So freedom actually means to be a darn fool and not do it. Do not to wear a helmet if I don't want to, but it's good for you. As Professor Priego would tell you, that one of the rare situations where the government is seatbelts. Other than that, there's a whole host of potential, this is good for you, that don't seem to meet the test. So he is suggesting that a free life, choosing the highest indifference curve, so to speak, that in his microeconomics, and again, we could talk about are there certain things you shouldn't choose, but Friedman seems to dance around that because I think he presumes a decent society and people aren't going to engage in sort of buying and selling human beings. But his idea is that, in a sense, freedom is a means to an end. But at certain stages, you must take it as an end in itself, but ultimately it is happiness or satisfaction or reaching the highest indifference curve. Without somebody telling you, this is a better indifference curve than that one, you should eat organic, you should do this, that, and the other, and a whole bunch of what we might call do-gooders in the world that Friedman is suspicious about, because basically that means that I am a perpetual child, and I have to take orders from my parents who happen to be involved in the paternalistic state. So that's his understanding of freedom. It's not just political freedom, it's individual freedom. And at one stage, if you ask him, pick a country in the world, where you say, sort of exemplary, if there is such a country, other than in the world of ideas, if there is such a country, what would it be? And his answer would be Hong Kong. But that was before the takeover, or the giveover, or let us see after 50 years. So his point is that you cannot have this political freedom or individual freedom without free markets or capitalism. And that can be tested. And you can do a little matrix. As some of you know that I love to do a matrix. You can do, on one side, you can do that economic liberty and political liberty. And another one is economic liberty and political control. And he would call that an illusion. Although there are a number of illusions that seem to be trying to put that into practice. For example, how about China? How about Pinochet himself? A third one might be economic control and political freedom. That's, I think, for Friedman, an absurdity. Not only in ideas, but in reality. And then you've got the fourth one, which is economic control and political control. And that would be his understanding of the totalitarian state. So there's a difference between the parental state and the totalitarian state. The parental state is the welfare state, and it never seems to stop trying to do us good. So we can do another little matrix, which involves where does the problem come from? Does the problem come from the market, like market failure? You take a look at the Depression, that Great Depression of the 30s, that certainly seems to be market failure. So the answer to market failure is not more markets, at least part of this matrix. You can have them, well, what is the answer to market failure if it's not more markets? The answer to market failure is government intervention, to try to make sure that the markets work properly because they do not work properly themselves. Another part would be that you have government failure. And then what is the answer to that? Friedman would say, in practice, more government. And you could just take a look at putting down train lines from Union Station to Pasadena. They expected a certain number of riders, and it didn't meet it after a year. So what is the answer? The answer is more railroads. You put it out to Claremont, and ultimately Palm Springs. So that's the answer. Why people aren't riding? Aha! Because we don't have enough lines. So we have to build more lines. So government failure requires more government. And Friedman's answer is government failure means more markets as the solution for the problem. So if one huge lesson, it seems to me, and we can test it, is if Friedman correct, that you cannot have political freedom without economic freedom. Is he correct? I see that leads to a problem that I've never quite solved in reading Friedman. Is he talking about correlations, or is he talking about causations? And is he talking about inevitability? Example, when he says you cannot have political, individual, social freedom without economic freedom, is he saying once you have economic freedom, then automatically, ipso facto, political and individualism will follow? Is it sort of a prediction, scientific prediction? Or is it a correlation that in the history of the world, you look through it, you do see a correlation between economic liberty and political liberty, certainly within the Western world anyway. So that's a sort of a testable issue. The second point, that's capitalism and freedom. The second point would be to take a look at the dedication. I mean, I'm trying to do what Friedman might do. Look at the obvious. Before you get all complicated about things, look at the obvious. The obvious here is the dedication to Janet and David. And it reads, and their contemporaries, which I think would include us after 50 years. And the dedication is, who must carry the torch of liberty on its next step. And that raises a very interesting question. Why must liberty have a torch all the time to be carried to the next step? Why isn't liberty the default position in life? And I think a very important question. I mean, if I were to, equality and security seem to have a default position today. You don't have to justify. For example, it's in the readings here dealing with Social Security, so it's not dealing with healthcare, but you can add healthcare. And his point would be, okay, why are you regimenting 80% of the population in order to provide for 20% of the population? Although I'm not a majority rule guy, I would say, why must we change the entire society in order to satisfy those who seem to be on the margins? And he said, every time we've done that, somehow we have failed to solve the problem. So just remember that, he says. And so the torch of liberty has to be carried through every generation, because liberty is not somehow the natural position that people congregate toward, but it is something else. And that something else for Friedman is some species of corporatism, some species of collectivism, and with Hayek it comes through very, very clear. Namely, when people start talking about the public good and the general welfare, you know they're up to no good and no welfare. Or lots of welfare, but not for me. And that somehow this notion that, and if I stand up to it, I'm callous. If I stand up to it, somehow there's something wrong with me. And the more I read Roosevelt and the New Deal, the more I recognize that the problem that Friedman is fighting in terms of America is really different from the problem that Hayek was fighting, which is really a European problem. Hayek is fighting old-fashioned socialism and ownership of the means of production in a class structure that goes way back in societies that have been killing each other for centuries, and including World War II, just about to, around the corner for Hayek. And so Hayek is concerned that Europe will go back to its old ways of collectivism and not make the breakthrough. Friedman is operating, I think, within a slightly different climate. The climate is where freedom is not the default position, but freedom has a chance. Or individualism has a chance. From the Jeffersonian model, it still has a chance. But the more I read about the New Deal, the more I understand what I think Friedman is up against. And if I were to choose one speech or one address from the 20th century that everybody should read before they graduate, it's Roosevelt's Commonwealth Club address in 1932, in the midst of the campaign against Hoover. And he goes through this history of America. That was Hamilton, and the problem with him is that he was a monarchist, but he loved strong government. And then on the other hand, you had Jefferson. He loved liberty, but his problem was that he liked limited government. And we're beyond that. He did like individual liberty, but we're beyond that too. We're into corporate liberty. Everyone. And so Roosevelt and his second inaugural really puts this down. I look outside and I see 1/3 of the people ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed. And my understanding of Friedman is, and what about the 2/3 that are? I mean, what's wrong with that? No countries have been able to do that. Why are you pursuing this impossible dream? And the answer is because it is fair, it is social justice, it is the right thing to do, it's the decent thing to do. And Friedman would come back with a very practical thing, and that is, and how much does it cost? And how do you know, isn't there a diminishing returns to all this activity? And this notion of democracy being everyone, rather than majority rule, for FDR, and democracy being some kind of individualism for Friedman, really, it seems to me, sets the battle. And that the old-fashioned understanding of democracy as majority rule, per se, has gone. Now, you can point to that the majority is pretty well off as a sign that improvement and progress is taking place, and much better than anywhere else in the world. But once you put in the standard of everyone, then you've introduced a different standard of fairness and a different standard of what you're going to accomplish. So I think that one of the things to bear in mind about who or what Friedman is fighting against is to think of the Commonwealth Club speech, where bluntly FDR says the era of the free enterpriser is over. The era of producing more and building more roads and building more this and that and the other is over. The case now is redistribution. The issue now is that we have arrived at the era of the enlightened administrator. And that really would get under Friedman's gut. That that's an oxymoron. An enlightened administrator. It doesn't happen. But you go to school, you get your toolkit, and you know what's going on. And somehow, by becoming this enlightened administrator, you're no longer interested in class, you're no longer interested in yourself, you are now a public servant, dedicated to the public good. And you get Hayek and Friedman echo Adam Smith, that not much good comes from those people who set themselves up to do the public good. And why don't you let people be? Why don't you let people alone to make their own decisions in life, to be the darn fool? Why don't you let them do that? Because it's not good for you. And this theme keeps repeating itself, as well as the theme of social justice. Now, to sort of, I hope I've given you some, I want to have a conversation about Freedman with you. But let me turn to, I mean, there are two tests that Friedman would give to see whether or not America is becoming more free or less free. Friedman loves mathematics, and that was one of my great surprises when I arrived at the University of Chicago. I just read this book, which seems to be, readable, and I was 21, which also shows stupidity, and lots to learn. And you realize that the journal, all these top flight schools had a journal, and it was called the Journal of Political Economy. Hey, this is good. So I walk into class on the first day, and there are mathematical formulas all over the board. And he is in such a land of joy. It's not just because it is beautiful, but somehow it proves what is going on. And I had a jolt of reality. And I have the book that we use, and I've shown it to Professor Sexton, to Prieger, and Blanco about it. It's sort of a little joy. However, what I want to suggest is that there are two tests, and you can do it mathematically, you can do it through discussion. There are really two tests that Friedman uses. One test is the amount of national income, the percentage of government spending, the amount of government spending as a percentage of national income. That's one test that he uses. So that in 1928, when Hoover was elected, there was something like 15%, roughly. And so Friedman's sort of real model, if you pushed him, it would be 10%. Government can do whatever it has to do. He's not an anarchist. Government could do whatever it has to do, defense, etc., 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 with 10% of the national income. Any deviation from that, for Friedman, is a deviation from freedom. And the deviation from freedom, meaning more and more government, means less and less capitalism, or free markets, as he understands it. So that's a sort of a statistical or mathematical or quantitative understanding of how to measure freedom. And so by 1977, that number had reached 40%. And you can say, well, it's World War II. But the main reason, says Friedman, for that great increase is this illusionary proposition that Ronald Reagan used to mock. I'm from the federal government, and I'm here to help. And which clearly learned from Friedman. And so his point would be the great growth from 15% to 40% is due not to foreign policy and war, which would be a legitimate function of government, but rather it's due to the growth of the welfare state, Department of Education, Health, Education and Welfare, the Great Society Program, Medicare, etc. That's where it comes. So Friedman would keep the idea alive that with the growth of the state in areas of public policy dealing with public health, public education, etc., freedom is not necessarily enhanced. Security, you're more secure because you're more free, rather than you're more free because you're more secure. And I think that's the battle. How much security does one need in order to be free? And then with the freedom comes the security that you're a human being and you make your own choices, including the wrong choices. So that if we track that and say, well, what about the Reagan Revolution of the 80s? And if we use this figure, well, the percentage of national income falls to about, government spending falls to about 35%. And so the question that you can ask is 5% a revolution? And just how much then in practice can Friedman's ideas work? But we keep the idea alive. The ICC gets gutted for Friedman. the idea that you have conscription rather than a volunteer army. Friedman was a member of the commission that recommended a volunteer army. I mean, that might seem odd from somebody like Friedman, who's called a conservative, but he's you know what, he really does represent a certain important part of American conservatism. One part of American conservatism is an attempt to preserve or conserve individual liberty. And that might seem an oddity, but that's that kind of conservatism. It's not a paleoconservative who wants to take us back to I don't know where, Jerusalem, ancient Rome, someplace. There's someplace that Ted was like. I feel comfortable with. That's not the kind of conservatism that Friedman is. This is sort of an attempt to conserve individual liberty. And so what he's fighting against is not those who would take us back prior to the American Revolution, but those who want to take us forward on some march of progress to progressivism. All right, so now we get to the end of Reagan, and we go into the Bush era, and it starts climbing back up. And we all know why that is, why it climbs up. Again, it's the health area, that the percentage goes back up to 40%. And when Obama came in, I think it was about roughly 43, something like that. It's up to about 50 now. And no wonder this idea of liberty in danger, or the challenge to liberty, is still alive. Another test that Friedman might use is to see, and it's on page 34, I believe, 35, and I'll end with this one. If I can find where I put my glasses. In my pocket, that's a good place for it. He lists 14 items. So one test is the percentage national income test. Linked to that would be a test of how much of your income is being taken in taxes. And so he would recommend something like, well, 10% will do the trick. But now we've got people arguing over that 35% is too low. Who should we tax, etc., etc. So the other test, that's one test, right? The other test that he would give to freedom would be to say, take a look at 14 items, and I invite you to think about these 14 items and add to them. Actually stood the test of 50 years. The first one is parity price support programs for agriculture. These are the kinds of things that government should be doing. The burden of proof then is on government to do these. After we accept neighborhood effects, after we accept that there are certain things that can't be done individually or collectively on a local level, what is it legitimate? And ask yourself, are these still around or do we have new ones? Parity price support program for agriculture. Tariffs on imports or restrictions on exports, such as current oil import quotas, sugar quotas, etc. The whole idea of regulating foreign trade. To what extent has the trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and America been an improvement in this area from the Friedman point of view? Number 3, government control of output, such as through farm program. Rent control, such as is practiced in New York, or more general price and wage controls. 5, legal minimum wage rates. 6, detailed regulation of industries with the Interstate Commerce Commission. Regulation of banking. I think that's increased. Number 7, a similar example, but one which deserves special mention because it's implicit censorship and violation of free speech. Federal Communications Commission is the arm of the FCC, sort of deeper, wider than it was before. This was written before a lot of cable TV came into digital. Is this an issue which has increased or not? Present Social Security programs, he says, especially the old age and retirement programs, which compel people to spend a specified fraction of their income on the purchase of retirement annuity and to buy the annuity from a publicly operated enterprise. Can't we just simply, because he doesn't talk about health care, he talks about Social Security, which is why I mentioned the New Deal. Once you start moving the great society, and then it turns more to health as an issue. Can we just plug in health there and in number 8 and get Friedman's answer to the health care? Number 9, licensing provisions, where the license is more often a receipt for a tax which anyone who wishes to enter the activity may pay. all of this is dealing with his opposition to monopoly, and that somehow with monopoly, control markets, you get political monopoly. But with free markets, you get free people. Number 10, so-called public housing, and the host of other subsidy programs directed at fostering residential construction, such as FHA and VA, guarantee of mortgage and the like. I think Friedman's interpretation of the housing crisis and the recession is it's done by government. Government interference, pushing when it should be pulling, and pulling when it should be pushing, because it doesn't know what's going to do, because the economy is too complicated for an enlightened administrator to understand and run. Number 11, conscription to man and military services in peacetime. And his point, when asked later, because let me give it number 12, 13, and 14 before I add this. National parks, the legal prohibition on the carrying of mail for profit. He's even against a monopoly of the post office. Publicly owned and operated toll roads, as noted above. So those are 14 points that he brings up in 1962. And if we were to use those 14 or extend those 14, which he does on page 35 and 36, as our second test of freedom or danger to freedom, I mean, what would we add and how would we assess the situation? There's much more that I could talk about, but I think that I've talked enough, and I want to hear what you would like to talk about. And the blessings of liberty fall upon you. And also to you.
I would really like to know what it was like studying under him.
Well, it was way back, let me tell you.
You can remember.
Oh, I remember vividly when a bunch of us were excited, particularly about the idea of taking on the paternalistic state. Because when you're 21, at least you have the element that you're leaving your parents. And you want to stand on your own. So there's something, I think, attractive about that. But when we got together with a couple of us got together, this is all well and good, but could you stop talking about vouchers? Because the voucher program back in the 1960s was simply an idea in his head. Why? Because it would break the monopoly of government-controlled schools, and it would at least give the choice to parents where to go. So I think we were a bit embarrassed by his push for vouchers. It turns out that one of the few elements that have made it from ideas to actual policy is a voucher program. He lived right opposite, so we chatted. And what does it mean? It means you study. It means you study. You know your math. You know the arguments. You know I mean, in certain ways, he gets bored about all ideas after a while. He can measure it. I mean, his case against, so if we go back and think about the arguments between free enterprises and socialists, Adam Smith defended free enterprise against something, and that was, say, mercantilism. So it was an idea that is up against a practice. And then the origin of socialism, in many ways, is an idea attacking what they consider to be the practice of free enterprise, which was to doom Charles Dickens, read the Pygmalion, read all of it, so that capitalism hurts the working class. And then you get somebody like John Stuart Mill, who comes along and says, I'm going to fight the idea of socialism with the idea of free enterprise or liberty. And then when you get to Friedman, what he's trying to argue, although he's arguing an idea, he's trying to suggest, if we look at the facts, capitalism is better than socialism because capitalism delivers the goods. And so part of our problem when we talked with him was, what if socialism were more efficient than capitalism? I still wouldn't choose socialism. And the reason why is because it won't happen. But what if it did happen? It won't happen. Well, what if it did happen? And what is your defense of freedom? Is it simply, it helps you reach the Pareto optimum? I mean, he's on the highest indifference curve. What if the indifference curve stinks? So there's always this problem we have, what we might now call the moral issue. Because Friedman was a positivist. And so that, what was his defense of freedom? Ultimately, it's not based on natural rights, it's not based on we get our rights from God. I think certainly he opposes getting our rights from government. So where do these rights come from? So I think the problem that we had, those of us who had a qualitative bent, were always pushing, trying to find an answer about, is efficiency your main goal? Is reaching the highest indifference curve what this is all about? Yeah. What about the social responsibility of business? Well, he says the responsibility of business is to get the largest profit for the stockholders. But what if out there you've got this narrative which says, look at business, fat cats, nasty cigars, smoke-filled rooms, greed. Isn't there at least some prudence involved by business to present itself in the community as somehow doing good for the community? And that would set him off. The whole idea of some people doing good for others is really part of this classical liberal problem. And I think that those of us who think that doing good to others might lead to doing good for ourselves might have a little problem with that. So this is, in a sense, wholly secular understanding of liberty. Yes?
I understand Friedman's kind of notion towards the free market, but in comparison to a more heavily regulated one. But in this situation, as of where we are today, how would we move towards that, and how would we sort of undo the regulations that we have, especially with these social programs that, you know, from the New Deal that most people still want to have? So how do we move, I guess, in essence, how do we move towards it?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think which shows that there's a certain pessimism in practice, but there's an optimism in the idea. And that's, I think, at the core. I mean, what do you do? Well, you can take a position of one step at a time. And it's like teaching and learning. If I look out in the state of civic education in this country, what you folks do not learn in high school, and what you further do not learn before high school, I shiver. But you're here. But that's the task of a teacher, how to keep going when students are coming in, not dumber. No. But I see 1/3 of the students coming in ill-prepared, ill-equipped, such and such, right? So I think the idea is one step at a time. Now, and also there are certain times when it seems to be more prudent to do that. For example, privatization is not a very good thing. You cannot expect privatization to extend within this climate. So I think what you do is you keep the idea alive until such time as a practice may be introduced. Here's the point, the better the economy, the more the opportunity seems to be to put into practice some of these things. Of course, the better the economy, the more money to pay for the welfare state. It's a battle. And that's why I think the dedication is important, which says to Janet and David and their contemporaries who must carry the torch of liberty on its next lap. And so you keep the torch alive and you do one step at a time. Now, the outcome may not take place in your lifetime. And so you have to find somebody to pass the torch to. And hopefully there are enough people who want to be free, willing to do that.
Yeah, so when Milton Friedman, I guess he graduated from Rutgers in 32, just early on, he was coming into his own at the beginning of the Depression. To what degree do you think that hearing the Commonwealth speech and being there for this tumultuous time of seeming market failure, how did that shape the way he thought to respond to those things?
Well, I cannot give you like chapter and verse and this page is such and such. But what I can say is that the Chicago boys, they're infamously called with regard to Chile in the 1970s or whatnot. The origin of that would be the Chicago School, which is a less derogatory term. The Chicago School actually grew around a person called Frank Knight, who, in my opinion anyway, ought to have had a Nobel, but at that time they hadn't invented it. And Frank Knight had as his students, imagine this, he had as his students Friedman, Stigler, Buchanan, and Samuelson. And Samuelson went off the reservation. Right? But those four, plus others, were at the core of Frank Knight. And I think the Chicago School, I can't prove this, but this is my hunch in terms of time and location, etc. The Chicago School is an attempted reaction to the growth of Keynes' general theory, which came out in 1936. But these guys are talking about markets. You have a deep concern in the 1920s about whether the reparations are going to work for World War I, where are the markets going. You have a concern with the arrival of Hitler, Stalin is over there. So the political question of totalitarianism and the attraction that even Westerners were having to planned economy, the New Deal, planned economy. So I cannot specify precisely that it's the Commonwealth speech or specifics, but it seems to be more than circumstantial. I use the Commonwealth speech because I think it sums up exactly what these guys are trying to deal with. And the understanding is basically that people do not know. It's too complicated. Their life is too complicated for people to know what the right choices are in their individual life. Therefore, we must substitute in the name of fairness, in the name of social justice. And that, I think, is the origin that the Chicago School is a pushback on that. I mean, how do you defend limited government and markets at a time when it looks like it's market failure? And so one of Friedman's contributions from that is to show that it was not market failure, but rather failure of the Federal Reserve. It was a monetary issue. That's the cause of the Depression. I mean, Keynes comes along and he's attractive because, yeah, market failure, but government can fix it through fiscal policy. And so one of the Chicago School's contributions, it seems, and it comes out in Friedman, is the revival of monetarism, which essentially says that if you must do anything, control inflation. And that you must control the money supply. And then instead of looking toward government to solve problems, you look to the market to solve problems. So again, although I cannot specify, I think that whole argument that's going on. So that in 1947, at the end of World War II, you get the creation of the Mount Pelerin Society. And that's named after the mountain where they all met. I think Stigler was there, Friedman was there, Pierre Goodrich was there. Pierre Goodrich is the originator of Liberty Fund. So the Liberty Fund has a libertarian aspect to it. And so you've got these libertarians who get together in Mount Pelerin Society. Hayek, yes, was there. Yeah, and the conversation, which I don't know that it's recorded, but the conversation went something like this: how do we save liberty in a world of collectivism, where the market seems to have been trashed because it failed, and individuals cannot control their own emotions or whatever, and we have enlightened administrators to take care of this. So the Mount Pillar, but the problem with the Mount Pillar Society is it attempted to join what we might call the libertarians and your genuine conservatives, who are public. See, genuine conservatives like Burke have a sense of the public good, that there is a common good that's out there. Libertarians, by the time 1940s, 30s, 40s, or 50s come along, libertarians see anybody who talks about the public good as, aha, that is code for controlling my life. And so so in the Mount Pelerin Society itself, you had a potential clash. And I think, I haven't followed the Mount Pelerin Society lately, but I do know that there was this clash between your traditional Burkean conservative and your more libertarian who wishes to conserve individual liberty. And that, by the way, that clash, there was shall we say, a compromise and I'm looking for the word and it escapes me. It's a compromise, it's an attempt to sort of cool things down and have a compromise, have an agreement. That word gone. Anyway, those two groups came together again in the 1960s, right after Capitalism and Freedom. And you get Buckley with a National Review joining Friedman with the Capitalism and Freedom to create the Philadelphia Society. And guess what? The Philadelphia Society is wrapped between the libertarians on the one hand and the traditional conservatives on the other. And now you have the input of a new post-World War II kind of conservative, the neocon. And recently, the old-fashioned conservatives decided to break away from the Philadelphia Society because it's not truly conservative. Movements have a heck of a lot of quarrels internally. Whether it's the liberal movement, women's movement, the communist movement just kills you. You leave the world rather than leave the association. Jim.
Last question.
Gordon, didn't Friedman also have some experience with during World War II with controlling prices? Wasn't he in he was in the what's the name of the organization in the government that price control?
Yeah, I don't know that, but I'm not surprised. Virtually everybody who had some kind of.
I was thinking he even worked with Galvin for a while.
Yeah, and by the way, he had a column in Newsweek for a couple of decades in which he would quarrel with Samuelson, he would quarrel with Galbraith. I mean, I think he was from what I remember him is he loved to talk. He loved to argue. And he could hold an argument. And if he stakes his position on libertarian grounds, he dares you to defend liberty on any other ground.
I think we're going to stop the questions now here, but Dr. Lloyd will be at the reception, so if you want to ask Professor Lloyd questions, he'll be happy to chat with you about Friedman. So thank you so much for coming. And remember, I have a couple of free copies of Capitalism and Freedom, so if you want one, come and see me.
So how long will the reception last?
Oh, the reception will be around 30 minutes.
All right. Why don't we